Hi, my name is Janice Switlo, and today I'm going to start into the subject of Ruperts Land. I'll be doing a number of different episodes at different times, instead of doing one huge chunk that makes it a little more difficult to watch. So what I'm going to do is, as I come across some of the commentaries or issues as I'm working through a large library, if you will, this time being able to free me up to do that kind of work, I'm going to start in, and so each episode will be a continuation. So this will be, Ruperts Land Part 1, and then there'll be subsequent parts as well. So if someone wants to just get into that, they can follow through and I can reference the earlier episodes. So I want to today just compare how history gets changed and how easily it happens, and how it then indoctrinates Canadians and as well Indigenous nationals to think about things. If you look to a modern history book, this is the one done by Peter C. Newman, who came to Canada in 1940, and his book was published in 1995. Here's a little commentary he makes about Ruperts Land. The roots of Western alienation stretched back to when the territories originally joined Confederation. British Columbia, as an established colony, entered on its own terms, demanding construction of the CPR to seal the bargain. The Great Canadian Plains had no such leverage. Eventually divided into 3 provinces, the land was acquired directly from the Hudson's Bay Company, which sold territory lands to Canada in 1870 for $1.46 million in cash, a grant of 45,000 acres around its 120 outposts, and another land grant of 7 million fertile acres in the west. Quote, "We have quietly and almost without observation annexed all the country between here and the Rocky Mountains," Sir John A. Macdonald boasted to a colleague. It was true. Neither the HBC factors nor any of the settlers then occupying the territory were consulted or even officially notified of the buyout. And it goes without saying that the Indigenous nations who actually still own the land weren't informed of, this so-called sale by them, or the fact, how did the Crown come to own this so as to be able to, obtain underlying title. So it's really important to understand that when the charter was issued to the Hudson's Bay Company, it was a charter allowing for trade. They have a monopoly for business purposes in this part of the world. So in 1995, though, that's translated into, oh, well, they owned the land and they sold it. Hudson's Bay Company sold it. But it's important in law to understand what were the interests that were being sold, and how does that create new interests or not. If you look back, however, to an earlier history book, one that was published in 1958, yes, this one's A Short History of Canada by D.C. Masters, you'll hear a correct recounting of this time in Canadian history. It says the territorial area of the Dominion. Remember, Canada is not Canada. Its proper legal name is the Dominion of Canada. There's a reason for that. That's because Canada doesn't own underlying title. There is a control, a dominion, an assertion of sovereignty. The territorial area of the Dominion was rapidly extended after 1867, which of course is when the British North America Act, 1867, was passed in England. That's now been renamed the Constitution Act 1867. The first acquisition was the territory previously controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company and known officially as Ruperts Land and the Northwest Territory. Remember, it was the territory previously controlled. Now, as was the habit, there was no governance, there was no Her Majesty's sovereignty, there were no permissions allowing for her to exercise any partial political sovereignty these times. What would happen is the company, for instance, being given the charter to engage in business, a non-competition, you know, a unique monopoly position, they had to maintain some sense of order over their own people. So what was taking place when they talk about controlling the area, it's speaking about what kind of law was in place in order to control these people who had come there to engage in business. Those laws, it's important to understand, were not formal governance laws. They were corporate directives. They were corporate, the company decision on how they wish to conduct their affairs and how they'll discipline or not or promote their employees. So certain expectations were laid out by the Hudson's Bay Company, and they expected their people to conform to that. That is not acquiring underlying title. That is got nothing to do with the Indigenous nationals and their nations. That was strictly how this company of Hudson's Bay Company decided to control its own people and where they were and what they were doing. But the importance, so this book in 1958, it's correctly referencing, this wasn't owned by Hudson's Bay Company. It was merely where they were trading, and the only source of law vis-a-vis British people was being exercised by a company over their employees, and how they would conduct trade and business and what standards they held themselves to. That was the only source of law for them. Keep in mind, the Indigenous nations, their own source of law, you know, wasn't disturbed by any of that, and their ownership in the land was not disturbed by any of that. This is why after Canada bought out the interests, this right to trade, to be present, etc., it was still necessary for the Crown to enter into treaties with the Indigenous nations. Otherwise, there would be no ability to exercise partial political sovereignty in the absence of those treaties being made. That's all I have to say for now.